Good evening. I'm Deb Goodrich, and it's wonderful to be with you. I am in Oakley, Kansas. I wish I could be there at the Oil Museum in El Dorado with you all tonight. I love Butler County. One of my favorite early memories of living in Kansas, I moved here in 92, is driving through Butler County one evening in September, and there was this incredible harvest moon. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. We have that experience out here, of course, but there was something about that and the hills, and it was just spectacular. So can't wait till I can come and join you in person. Thank you to my dear friend Ken Spurgeon for asking me to be with you all. Ken and I have been partners in crime for a long, long time, and I just won't let him do a project unless I can be involved somehow. So I'm his demanding squeaky wheel friend, if you will. And you are so fortunate to have him with you there. He is an amazing man, a scholar, historian, filmmaker, and gentleman. So you're very, very lucky. I'm speaking to you this evening about one of my favorite topics. This is Charles Curtis. So, Charles Curtis, this is a Kansas State Historical Society publication, um, was vice president under Herbert Hoover. So, the 1920s. And of course, the 1920s were a very interesting time in American history. And the Hoover administration, of course, is most famous for the stock market crash. And I think Ken addresses that in some of his history classes. Maybe some of you were also students of Ken's, in addition to being patrons of the Oil Museum. So that probably helps obscure Charles Curtis in history. The fact that the Hoover administration was not really that popular after the stock market crash and the Great Depression. But he is a remarkable figure in Kansas history and American history, and he deserves a lot more attention. I've been researching him for decades. I first became aware, honestly, of Charles Curtis in the cemetery in Topeka when I moved to Kansas in 1992. Being a Southerner, I grew up in southwestern Virginia. We love dead people, so I would walk through the cemetery, and that's how I got to know the community. And honestly, that served me so well. And when I would visit historic Topeka Cemetery, which I urge you to do if you visit Topeka, I actually lived there for a while. I was the historian in residence at the Topeka Cemetery. So I urge you to visit that place and pay your respects at Charles Curtis's grave. Um, Sarah McNeve was the unofficial historian there, and she would take me to his grave and those of some of our other founding fathers, and that's how I came to know Kansas. And I became enamored of Curtis immediately. So, and if you see a little munchkin in the background, we have not left Oz or not in Oz yet. We are still in Kansas, but I'm babysitting because, as I'm sure with many of you, babysitting, back to school, and all that stuff is sort of a challenge right now. So I may have my assistant here help me a little bit with this talk. She just woke up from a nap. Charles Curtis was born in 1860, January 1860, in North Topeka. So that is the part of Topeka that is north of the Kansas River. Now, that land north of the Kansas River, without getting too complicated, was part of what they called the half-breed lands. So the people who inherited that were actually mixed French and native, mostly Kaw and Osage. So those were mixed bloods, if you will, and Charles Curtis's mother was part of that family from the Papins or the Papons, or there's just several pronunciations depending on where you are and who you are. Pappan is the last name. So again, French and Kaw and Osage. When Charlie was born, that was still the Kansas Territory. We don't become a state until a year later in January of 1861. So I thought it quite remarkable that Charlie was born during the territorial period. And his life is a microcosm of the history of the West. So Charlie is born to Helen Pappan and Jack Curtis, otherwise known as Captain Jack. And Curtis had come from Indiana. He had then later on moved much of his family. His parents actually followed him out rather than the other way around. Now, he had been married before. In fact, sorting out his marriages is quite the genealogical task, but I believe there were 5 of them in all. But he had divorced his first wife and left a wife and children in Indiana. So then he met this, by all accounts, we don't have a photograph of Helen, a very beautiful young woman, quite a bit younger than Orrin Arms Captain Jack Curtis was. And they married and they had 2 children. They had Charlie and then they had a little girl, Elizabeth. And then Mrs. Curtis became ill and died. Charlie was only 3 years old. So 3 years old puts us in 1863. So after his wife passed away, Captain Jack Curtis enlisted in the 7th Kansas and the 7th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry. Ken can tell you a lot about them. He can fill you in on that story. But they were otherwise known as the Jayhawkers, Jennison's Jayhawkers. And Jack was not only a Jayhawker, he was a redleg, so-called for wearing red leggings on their pants. So Captain Jack is, how could I characterize him? Just imagine Captain Jack Sparrow, you know, Johnny Depp, without the redeeming qualities, and you pretty much get Captain Jack Curtis. He is something else. Now, while the Redlegs are known for their forays into Missouri, hunting, looting, killing, just a score of bad things, he was the cream of the crop. He is, in fact, court-martialed near the end of the war because he executed Confederate prisoners in his charge. So even among some of the other thieves, he's bad news. He is sentenced to a year hard labor, but he is pardoned just shortly into that sentence, and I don't know why. I haven't found the details on that, but if that's a great research topic if you want to look into that. Okay, so in the meantime, these poor children are orphans. Where are they? They will stay for a time with Charlie and Elizabeth's white grandmother in Topeka, and for a time with their native French and Indian grandmother on the Kaw Reservation at Council Grove, Kansas. So it's a little hard to sort out if Charlie and Elizabeth are always kept together, but we know that around the age of 5, Charlie does go live with his maternal grandmother on the reservation, grandmother and grandfather on the reservation at Council Grove. So he is growing up, those formative years, the years he really remembers, on the reservation. So he is not native just in name. He has grown up with the culture as well. He recalled life on the reservation very fondly. He recalled it hunting and fishing and doing all the things that boys love to do. So For him, at least in his rosy memory, it was idyllic. He talked specifically about shooting nickels off sticks with arrows. So the tourist would come over and visit the Kaw Reservation because Council Grove is on the Santa Fe Trail. There's a lot of traffic there. So the tourist would come over and visit the reservation, and they would give the little boys a nickel, and they would cut kind of just a slit in the top of a stick and mount that on the stick, and the boys would shoot it off with their arrows. And if they knocked the nickel off, they got to keep it. So Charlie became very good at shooting the nickels off of these sticks, and he recalled this with great fondness. Now, other people in describing it talk about this is how poor they were, and saw it in a very different light. And I don't know quite how to judge that, but in Charlie's memory, this was a fond memory. Now, something that Charlie did not talk about that is very, very significant, and you will find a description. Give a plug to my friend Ron Parks, who used to be the curator at the museum there, the director at the museum in Council Grove, the Kaw Mission, which I highly recommend visiting, and they have redone it, and it's just phenomenal. The Darkest Period, the Kansas Indians and Their Last Homeland, 1846 to 1873. This is a fantastic book. So one of the things that it talks about is how the Kaw would go on buffalo hunts into western Kansas. So where I am now in Oakley, we're the middle of buffalo hunting country. If you come to Oakley, you'll see that grand statue, that incredible monument to Buffalo Bill Cody shooting a buffalo. He's in the hunt, and it's a spectacular piece by Charlie Norton. And that's a big piece of our history out here because we're the middle of that prime hunting ground. Well, that prime hunting ground was shared by a lot of tribes, including the Kaw, who would make an annual trek to the west to hunt buffalo. This also talks about how the Kaw had been diminished by the 1860s and then the 70s when they're forced into the Indian Territory. Through illness and so many other things, the Kaw Tribe has been greatly diminished. Well, trying to summarize this incredible story, the Kaw go west for a buffalo hunt. There is an encounter with the Cheyenne, which is a tribe that does not get along with the Kaw, and perhaps that's that encroachment on the hunting grounds. I'm not real sure, but there is an issue there with the Cheyenne. So the Kaw retreat rather quickly, but they have taken a Cheyenne scalp, and they're pretty happy about that. But they haven't had very much success at all with the buffalo hunt. So they come back through their reports of many of the tribal members stopping in Riley to ask for food, and many members of that delegation that went on the buffalo hunt died. So it was just a devastating event in Kaw history. But there were a couple of very significant outcomes of this. So they get back home. The Kaw who do survive get back home, and they have a traditional scalp dance. Now, young Charlie Curtis would have seen this. I have not recalled or not found, rather, any account of his recalling that episode, but it's one of those, the evidence points to he almost certainly had to be there when this occurred. So he is seeing this victory over the Cheyenne being celebrated, and what an incredible, I can't even imagine as a child what an incredible impression this would have made. Now, the other thing is, it really ticked off the Cheyennes. So in the summer of 1868, in June, the Cheyenne with Tall Bull and Roman Nose and these legendary war leaders march into Council Grove they're going to take out the Kaw at the reservation. And what did the good people of Council Grove do? They say, go for it, because they want them out of the way, because they've got some really nice ground there along the Santa Fe Trail. So they're more than happy to get the Kaw out of the way. It's a bizarre occurrence. I wrote an article on this in Wild West magazine for the anniversary, so that would have been 2018. So if you go online and search for it, you can find it, and I'll give Ken maybe a link so that he can share it with you, because it's a fascinating story. Okay, so the Cheyenne, this mighty Cheyenne nation, is surrounding the Kaw, basically. And the Kaw, probably not as ready for war as the Cheyenne. They've got to get help. So the leadership sends somebody to Topeka to carry a message. That's a meadowlark in the background. Not a real meadowlark, but nonetheless, it's very appropriate to have the Kansas state bird in the background, I think. So they send Charles Curtis. Now, in his accounts as an adult, when he's being interviewed for the newspapers and running for office, he will intimate that he was the only person sent because he could speak Kaw and English. He could translate. Well, not so. He accompanied his uncle, Joe Jim. And Joe Jim was an interpreter and an adult, and they made the 60-mile trek to Topeka to let the governor know what was going on in Council Grove. Now, the governor, one of my favorite people in Kansas history, is Governor Sam Crawford, who was elected during the Civil War. He was actually on the battlefield in Missouri when he was elected. So, you've got to find out more about him, and I'll be happy to come down and do a talk just about Governor Crawford sometime, who rests in the same cemetery as Charles Curtis. So they go to Topeka. Charles Curtis does go on this trip, and they tell the governor what's going on. Governor Crawford is outraged. He has been trying to get some help from the Army, because there are all these depredations going on in the western part of the state. And so he's been trying to get help from the Army. He's been trying to get permission to raise another unit. And now the Indians who are not being docile, and perhaps for good reason, are coming this far east. He couldn't believe it. He goes down to Council Grove, and by then the Cheyennes have left. In fact, there are varying accounts. There may have been one person wounded. There may have been one person killed. There may have been one person wounded on each side. It becomes a standoff and something of a non-event, except that it will affect the rations and the disbursement of items promised to the natives later on. So that's a little bitty incident, but it has a huge impact. The other impact that it has in Charles Curtis's life is that his grandmothers decide that he is no longer safe at the reservation, and he goes back to live in Topeka with his white family. Now, 5 years after that, in 1873, of course, Charles is just 13. His grandfather, Curtis, has just passed away. There's a lot of things going on in his life. He described himself as adrift. And the Kaw were being removed to the Indian Nations, now Oklahoma. And they go up to see the Potawatomi in north of Topeka. And they go up to visit their cousins, the Potawatomi. And on their way back, they send for Charlie. They're camped nearby, and they send for Charlie. And he comes out and camps with them. And some of his cousins convince him to go with them. And that's what he decides to do. But in the night, while they're camping, his grandmother, Papin, comes to him. And she wakes him up, and she says, "You can't go with us." She said, "There's no future for you. And you need to go back to your family in Topeka and get an education and become somebody. And he later said that everything he had become, he owed to that woman for um, basically making a very, very difficult decision to send him back to live with his other relatives. She said, I love you more than everything. You who are the child of my dead daughter, I love you more than everything. And that, as a grandmother especially, is just one of the most poignant stories I've ever heard. And I think it's a great example, too, of how history is people. It is personal. It's not just numbers and policies and military engagements. It's people. People are always at the heart of it. There's so much more to tell. So I hope that Ken will invite me back so that I can share more of our Charlie's story with you and so many other stories that are very meaningful to me. Again, looking so forward to coming to the Oil Museum in person and visiting with each and every one of you. Thank you.